She arrived in that town carrying a worn leather suitcase and a silence that was more than just shyness. Whenever she tried to speak around men, her voice simply wouldn't come out. Her throat would close up as if invisible hands were strangling her all over again. But there was something no one expected to find inside that frightened woman. Something that would change not only her life, but the life of a widowed farmer who was about to learn that true love is never in a rush. Can you imagine living in a world where your own voice was stolen from you, where the simple act of saying good morning to a man on the street makes your whole body freeze in panic, where words get stuck in your throat like stones you can neither swallow nor spit out? This story took place in rural Ohio in March of 1892, in the small town of Oak Hill. If you are watching this story right now, comment down below where you're tuning in from. It really helps the channel keep bringing these stories of resilience and true love to you. And if you aren't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon so you don't miss the next chapters of this emotional journey. The afternoon sun was hanging heavy over the dirt road that cut through the rolling Midwestern hills when Rachel Mary Carter climbed down from the peddler's wagon that had agreed to bring her this far. The man didn't even look back when she handed him the agreed-upon coins. He just whipped the horses and drove on, leaving behind a cloud of road dust that clung to her dark dress. Rachel stood there at the entrance to the town, gripping her suitcase with both hands, her knuckles white from the strain. She didn't want to let go of that suitcase. It was all she had left in the world. Oak Hill was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where news traveled faster than a runaway horse. 3 main dirt roads, a white-clapboard Methodist church at the top of the hill, a general store, 2 supply shops, and houses scattered among cornfields and apple orchards that rolled over the hills in endless green rows. The smell of burning firewood mixed with the damp earth from the previous night's rain. Cherry trees heavy with fruit marked the backyards. Chickens scratched freely in the dirt. Rachel took a deep breath and started walking. Every step took effort. People stopped to stare. A lone woman arriving in town with no husband, no family, and no one to meet her was bound to cause a stir. She felt their gazes like needles against her skin. She kept her head down, her lace scarf pulled up to cover her neck almost to her chin, despite the unseasonably warm March weather. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a tight bun. She was 26, but looked as though she carried decades more on her slumped shoulders. Mrs. Amelia Hayes was watering the ferns on her front porch when she spotted the young woman. A 58-year-old widow, she had that kind of wisdom that comes from living long enough to recognize pain in others without needing to ask. She saw the way Rachel walked, saw the scarf covering her neck in the heat, saw the suitcase held tight to her chest like a shield. And most of all, she saw her eyes, beautiful brown eyes, but dim, like an oil lamp burning out. Mrs. Amelia set down her watering can and walked down the 3 porch steps. "Miss," she called out, her voice firm but gentle, "are you lost?" Rachel stopped. She looked at the older woman, opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. Her throat seized. Panic flared in her chest. She squeezed the suitcase tighter, her eyes welling with tears. "Mrs." Amelia stepped closer, slowly, the way one approaches a spooked animal. "It's all right," she said softly. "You don't need to speak right now. Come, step inside, have a glass of water. We can sort things out later." Rachel hesitated. She looked back at the empty road, looked side to side at the curious stares of the neighbors. Then she looked at this woman with her grey hair braided back, calloused hands and kind eyes. And she nodded. Just a single nod. Inside, Mrs. Amelia's home. It smelled of sage and lye soap. The furniture was simple but well kept. A dark wooden table, chairs with woven rush seats, a sideboard with a family Bible, and a wooden cross. Rachel sat at the edge of her chair, the suitcase still in her lap. Mrs. Amelia brought cool water from an earthenware pitcher and placed the glass in front of her. "Drink it slowly," she said. Rachel drank. The water slid down her throat, cold and soothing against muscles that ached from tightening so much. When she finished, Mrs. Amelia sat across the table. She looked closely at the young woman. "You've come a long way," she observed. It wasn't a question. Rachel nodded. "Running from someone?" Rachel's eyes went wide. The fear was so palpable that Mrs. Amelia raised a hand to soothe her. "Easy, child. I won't tell a soul. And nobody here is going to turn you in. But I need to know if you're in danger so I can help you properly." Rachel looked at her own trembling hand on the edge of the table. She wanted to speak. She needed to speak. But the voice wouldn't come, so she did the only thing she could. She carefully opened her suitcase, pulled out a small black leather notebook and a pencil. She opened to a blank page and wrote, in beautiful, neat handwriting, "My husband. I fled New York. He hurt me very badly. I cannot speak around men." The voice won't come out. Mrs. Amelia read it, read it again, looked at the young woman in front of her, noting the scarf around her neck. She understood everything without needing another word. "Lord Almighty," she murmured. "You are safe here, child. You can stay with me. I have a spare room. And if you know how to sew, there's work. Plenty of folks around here need a good seamstress." Rachel wrote again. "I can sew and I can write. I can write letters for those who cannot. Mrs." Amelia smiled for the first time. "Then you must be heaven sent. Half this town can't read their own name. Folks are always needing someone to write letters to their kin, tally up accounts, read legal papers. You'll have more work than you know what to do with." And that was how Rachel Mary Carter began her new life in Oak Hill. Mrs. Amelia set her up in the back room, small but clean, with an iron bed, a wooden trunk, and a little window that looked out onto the backyard and the cherry tree. Rachel packed her few garments into the trunk, placed her notebook and pencil always within reach, and took her first real breath in months without feeling like she was going to die. But the peace was short-lived. In a small town, news spreads like wildfire. By her second day, when Rachel went with Mrs. Amelia to the general store, the whole town already knew. The strange girl who doesn't speak, the silent woman, the one who writes in the little book. The comments came in whispers, but she heard them. "Ain't deaf," they'd say. "Mute, poor thing. Or maybe she's touched in the head. A lone woman like that, bound to be an ugly story there." Rachel felt every stare like a lash. She kept her head down, shadowing Mrs. Amelia. At the general store, when the shopkeeper asked what she wanted, Rachel took 3 steps back, panic written all over her face. Mrs. Amelia stepped between them. "She doesn't speak with men, Mr. Jenkins," she explained firmly, "but she understands perfectly, and she's good people. Respect her." Mr. Jenkins, a 50-year-old man with a beer gut and tobacco-stained teeth, shrugged. "Long as her money's good, she can be mute, deaf, or whatever she pleases," he grumbled. But not everyone was crude. There was Mrs. Edith, a 70-year-old lady who asked Rachel to write a letter to her son up in Chicago. Rachel wrote it out in beautiful cursive, pouring care into every word the old woman dictated. Mrs. Edith wept when she saw the words of her heart looking so pretty on the page. "Bless you, child. You write like an angel. What do I owe you?" Rachel wrote, "Nothing. It was my pleasure to help." Word got around. The girl who doesn't speak but writes beautifully. In 3 days, there was a line at Mrs. Amelia's door. Folks wanting letters written, documents read, ledgers balanced. Rachel charged very little, sometimes nothing at all, if she saw the person was struggling. The money she saved went into an old biscuit tin beneath her bed. It wasn't much, but it was hers, earned through honest work. That meant freedom. And it was on one of these busy mornings that Matthew Turner showed up. Rachel was sitting on Mrs. Amelia's porch, penning a letter for Mrs. Tessa, who wanted to send news to her brother in Columbus. The morning light filtered through the leaves of the oak tree. Birds were singing. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen. Rachel was almost relaxed, her pen gliding across the paper, when she heard the sound of horse hooves. She glanced up and saw the man dismounting. Tall, broad-shouldered, a weathered Stetson hat shielding his face from the sun, denim work pants, a cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up revealing tanned, strong forearms. He tied his horse to the hitching post and stepped up onto the porch. Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs. The pen slipped from her hand. The panic rose so fast she couldn't catch her breath. She stood up too quickly, her chair scraping loudly across the wooden floorboards. She backed away until her shoulders hit the wall. The man stopped dead in his tracks. He raised his hands slowly, a gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice deep and calm. "I didn't mean to startle you. I just came to drop off a delivery for Mrs. Hayes." Rachel couldn't take her eyes off him, couldn't move. She was pinned to the wall, her heart beating so violently it hurt. She tried to speak, opened her mouth. Nothing. Her throat had closed shut completely. Mrs. Amelia came rushing out of the kitchen. "Matthew," she greeted, "what brings you by?" Then she saw Rachel cornered against the wall, pale as a sheet, trembling. "Ah, I see." She looked at the farmer. "She doesn't speak to men, Matthew. A bad trauma. You'll have to deal with me." Matthew looked at Rachel. He truly looked at her, not with pity, not with morbid curiosity, but with something she couldn't quite place. Recognition, perhaps. As if he saw past the frightened woman to the person buried beneath the fear. "I understand," he said slowly. "I am truly sorry. I didn't mean any harm." And then he did something that surprised everyone. He took 2 steps backward, giving her space. He took off his hat, holding it with both hands in front of him. He bowed his head just a fraction, a sign of respect. And he backed away, never turning his back on her, until he was down the porch steps. Only then did he turn and walk over to talk to Mrs. Amelia near his horse. Rachel slid down the wall until she hit the floor, her legs trembling too much to hold her weight. Mrs. Tessa, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, came over to her. "Breathe, child. Matthew wouldn't hurt a fly. He's the most decent man in this whole county." But Rachel barely heard her. Her heart was still racing, her throat tight, the panic pumping through her veins like poison. A decent man. She had heard that before. About him. About the husband who almost killed her. Outside, Matthew was speaking quietly with Mrs. Amelia. "Brought the linens you asked for," he explained. But his eyes kept darting back to the porch, to the young woman sitting on the floor, still shaking. "What happened to her?" he asked softly. Mrs. Amelia looked at the farmer. She had known Matthew since he was a boy. She knew he was a man of his word, that he treated everyone with respect, that he had never raised a hand in anger. "She suffered terribly," was all she said. "Ran away from something awful, trying to start over." Matthew nodded slowly. He understood without needing the gruesome details. "I don't want to frighten her," he said. "Next time I need to come by, I'll holler from the road first. That way she can go inside if she wants to." Mrs. Amelia smiled. "You're a good man, Matthew." He shrugged, placing his hat back on his head. "Just trying to be decent, Mrs. Hayes." He said his goodbyes, mounted his horse, and rode off without looking back. But Rachel had been looking. When he mounted his horse, she had peeked through the crack in the door. She saw the gentle way he handled the animal. She saw the slump in his shoulders, as if he carried an invisible weight. She saw that he didn't look back, respecting her boundaries. And she felt something tiny, almost imperceptible. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of the end of absolute terror. Mrs. Amelia came inside and sat on the floor next to Rachel. "That was Matthew Turner," she said softly. Owns Willow Creek Farm up in the hills. Widower. Lost his wife, Laura, 2 years back to a fever that took her in a week. Folks say he loved that woman more than life itself. It broke him when she passed. Hasn't looked at another woman since. Lives alone up there with his ranch hands, working the fields. Serious man, hard-working, respected. Never heard a soul speak ill of him. Rachel wrote in her notebook, "He scared me by accident. Any man scares me. I know, child, but listen to me. Matthew won't bother you. He understands. And if he's anything, he's a gentleman." Rachel filed those words away, but didn't believe them. Not yet. She had learned the hard way that words and actions were two very different things. Days turned into weeks. Rachel established a routine. Woke up early, helped Mrs. Amelia around the house, then sat on the porch to work. She sewed dresses, mended shirts, embroidered tablecloths, wrote letters, read documents, taught people how to sign their names. The work was steady. The money in the tin grew. She started sleeping better, the nightmares coming a little less often. But she avoided men like the plague. If she saw one on the street, she crossed to the other side. If a man walked into the store while she was there, she walked right out. At Sunday service, she sat in the most hidden corner, surrounded only by women. The Reverend tried to speak with her once. She fled the church and didn't return for 2 weeks. The town got used to it. The silent girl, the one who won't look at a man. She became a local legend. The women defended her fiercely. The men, for the most part, kept their distance. Some out of respect. Others because they figured she was crazy. But Matthew Turner came back. 2 weeks after their first encounter, he showed up again. But this time, he did things differently. He stopped his horse far from the house, still out on the road. He called out loudly, "Mrs. Hayes, anybody home?" Mrs. Amelia stepped out onto the porch. Rachel was inside, sewing near the window. "Come on up, Matthew," the older woman called back. He walked up the steps slowly, making his boots thud loudly on purpose to announce his presence. He carried a burlap sack. "Came to pick up my mending," he explained, "and I brought some coffee from my cousin's roastery as a thank you. Fresh batch, real good." Mrs. Amelia accepted the gift gratefully, but Matthew didn't sit down, didn't linger. He took his mended clothes, paid her, and left. Quickly, without even trying to catch a glimpse of Rachel. But he left the coffee. And that night, when Rachel drank the brew Mrs. Amelia prepared, she had to admit it was the best coffee she had ever tasted. Strong, bold, with no bitterness. It tasted like rich earth and honest work. Matthew kept coming back, always with an excuse. Bringing sewing jobs, asking for a button to be reattached, a pant hem fixed. He never stayed long, never tried to force contact. Just dropped things off, paid generously, and left. Rachel started noticing the pattern. She noticed he always shouted his arrival before stepping onto the porch, that he never looked directly at the door where she sometimes hid, that he treated Mrs. Amelia with genuine respect, never talking down to her. One day, he brought firewood. Winter was approaching, and Mrs. Amelia had mentioned needing to stock up. Matthew showed up with a wagon full of split logs, unloaded it all in the backyard, and refused payment. "It's a gift," he said simply, "for all the fine sewing work." Another time, he fixed the chicken coop fence that had broken during a storm. Mrs. Amelia hadn't even asked. He just noticed it, came back with his tools, and fixed it. Worked in the hot sun, sweating through his shirt, but never complained. When he finished, he washed his hands at the pump and rode off with just a wave. Rachel watched it all from her window, saw the way he worked, saw that he expected nothing in return, saw that he never, not once, tried to look at her or force his way into her space, and something inside her, something small that had died a long time ago, started to stir. It wasn't trust. It wasn't attraction. It was just the tiny, fragile idea that maybe, just maybe, not all men were exactly the same. 3 months after she arrived in town, Rachel did something that shocked even herself. Matthew had come to pick up a shirt she had mended. As always, he called out before stepping onto the porch. Mrs. Amelia brought him the shirt, wrapped in brown paper. He took it, paid, and thanked her. He was turning to leave when he noticed Rachel's notebook sitting on the porch table, open to a page filled with beautiful cursive. It was a letter she was drafting for Mrs. Geraldine to send to her son in Cincinnati. Matthew stopped. He stared at the elegant handwriting. "That is mighty fine penmanship," he commented to Mrs. Amelia. "Who wrote that?" "Rachel did," the woman replied proudly. "She writes letters for half the county, writes like a schoolmarm." Matthew nodded slowly. He kept his eyes on the letter a moment longer. Then he asked, "Does she take commissions for letters? Say, if a fellow wanted to send word but ain't too good with a pen?" "She does. That's her trade." Matthew stayed quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to commission a letter to my brother in New York City." He hesitated, then added, "What's her rate?" "You'll have to ask her. She sets her own prices." "How can I ask her if she won't speak to me?" he asked with simple, gentle logic, entirely devoid of sarcasm. Mrs. Amelia smiled. "Leave a note. She replies in writing." And that was how it started. Matthew came back the next day with a folded piece of paper. He left it on the porch table, weighed down by a stone. He left without waiting for an answer. Rachel found the note that afternoon. She opened it with trembling hands. The handwriting was bold, slanted, with a few spelling mistakes, but perfectly legible. "Lady with the pretty writing. I'd like to commission a letter for my brother in New York. Can you do it? How much does it cost? Respectfully, Matthew Turner." Rachel read it 3 times, looked at the empty road where he had ridden off, felt her heart beat differently, not with fear, with something she couldn't quite put a name to. She took her notebook and wrote a meticulous reply. "Mr. Turner, I can write the letter. The rate is 5 cents per page. Please leave what you wish to say in a note, and I will copy it out cleanly. Sincerely, Rachel Mary Carter." She left her reply in the exact same spot, pinned under the same stone. The next day, his answer was there. "Miss Rachel, it's a deal, but I wanted to write a longer letter, quite a few pages. Is that all right? I'll pay whatever's fair. And you can just call me Matthew. I ain't that old yet, Matthew." Rachel caught herself smiling, very briefly. A tiny smile, but a real one. It was the first time in months. She wrote back, "As many pages as you need. Bring the text whenever you are ready. Rachel." And so the letters began. Matthew would bring texts written in his clunky handwriting, sometimes on butcher paper because he didn't have stationery. Rachel would copy them out in her beautiful script, taking care with every loop, sometimes quietly fixing his spelling so as not to embarrass him. She'd leave it ready for the next day. He would pick it up, always leave a little extra coin, and ride away. But the contents of the texts began to change. At first it was simple news for his brother about the farm, the crops, the weather. Then personal details crept in. Matthew wrote about the wife he had lost, about the grief he still dragged around, about how hard it was to live in a house haunted by memories. He wrote about loneliness, about missing her, about wondering if he'd ever know how to be happy again. Rachel read those words and felt something break and rebuild itself inside her chest, because she understood. She understood every single word about pain, about loss, about wondering if happiness was a place you could ever return to. And one day she did something she had never done. She added a line at the very bottom of the letter in different, smaller handwriting, almost hidden. "Sometimes we think the pain will last forever, but life insists on moving forward. R." Matthew read that line 50 times. He kept that letter folded in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. And when he came back to drop off his next commission, he left a new note. "Thank you for the words. You understand. I know you understand. M." And then she wrote something that shocked her. It wasn't just anyone. It was you. Matthew kept that note with all the others, inside a leather pouch in his desk drawer. And that night, for the first time in 2 years, he prayed for something other than just the strength to survive the next day. He prayed with gratitude, for hope. The notes continued. But now there was a shift, an intimacy that hadn't existed before. Matthew started telling her about his life, about growing up in these hills, learning to run the farm from his pa, meeting Laura at a county fair, and knowing instantly she was the one. About their 2 happy years of marriage. About the day she died in his arms after a week of a raging fever that no doctor could break. Rachel felt every word, and she responded. She wrote about growing up in New York, the daughter of an immigrant merchant. About marrying at 21 to a man who seemed decent, but changed the minute the ink dried on the registry. About years of hell. About the scars she carried on her body and her soul. They traded pain for understanding, loneliness for companionship, even if it was only on paper. And slowly, something began to grow. Not love, not yet, but a profound connection between 2 people who understood what it meant to suffer and survive. Matthew began spending more time around Mrs. Amelia's house, always with an excuse, bringing fresh vegetables from the farm, eggs, honey, never getting too close to Rachel. But he was there, a constant, respectful, patient presence. And Rachel stopped running. When he arrived, she stayed on the porch, sewing. She didn't look directly at him, but she didn't flee. It was massive progress. Until one day, 3 months after the incident at the general store, it happened. Matthew was up on Mrs. Amelia's roof, patching a leak. Rachel was on the porch drafting a letter. Suddenly, the sky broke open. One of those violent summer downpours that hit without warning. Matthew scrambled down the ladder, but the rain was blinding. He couldn't even see well enough to get to his horse. "Get in here!" Mrs. Amelia shouted from the doorway. "You'll drown out there." Matthew climbed the porch steps, drenched to the bone, water pouring off his hat and clothes. He stood there awkwardly, dripping puddles onto the floorboards. Rachel was sitting in her chair in the corner. She looked at him, saw how uncomfortable he was, trying so hard not to encroach on her space, and she felt something move in her chest. Mrs. Amelia brought out a towel. "Dry your head, Matthew. You'll catch your death." While he dried off, Rachel did the unthinkable. She stood up, walked into the kitchen, and poured a cup of coffee. She walked back out with the steaming mug, and she held it out to him. Matthew stared at the mug, at her hand holding it, at her eyes, still cast downward, but no longer paralyzed with terror. He took the mug slowly, very carefully, making sure his fingers didn't brush hers. "Thank you," he said softly. Rachel nodded, retreated to her corner, sat down, picked up her sewing. But her hands were shaking, because she had voluntarily approached a man for the first time in years. And the world hadn't ended. Matthew drank the coffee slowly, savoring not the taste, but the meaning of it. When he finished, he set the mug on the table. The rain was easing up. "I ought to head back," he said. "Thank you for the shelter." He looked at Rachel. "And for the coffee. It was real good." She didn't answer, but she looked up at him for 2 full seconds, and to Matthew, that was worth more than 1,000 words. That night, both of them wrote in their personal diaries, things that would never become notes for the other to read, matters of the heart that were still too terrifying to share. Matthew wrote, "She gave me coffee, handed it to me herself. I know it sounds like nothing, but to me, it was everything. It means she doesn't see me as a threat anymore. Or at least, not only as a threat. I have to keep taking it slow. I can't ruin this." Rachel wrote, "I walked up to him. I didn't die. I didn't faint. I didn't have an attack. He took the cup and was gentle, like he always is. I keep wondering if it's possible, If after everything that happened, it's possible for me to ever trust a man again. I'm terrified, but I'm also hopeful, and I don't know which is worse." And so it was, between notes and coffee and small kindnesses, that something began to bloom, delicate as a new shoot after a hard freeze, fragile as a moth's wing, but real. But the peace was never going to last. Because 900 miles away, in New York City, Albert Carter had hired a Pinkerton detective to find the woman who had dared to run away from him. And this detective was good at his job. The letter arrived on an October morning. A standard envelope, cheap paper, cramped handwriting, addressed to the Oak Hill sheriff, but opened by a nosy clerk before it ever reached his desk. Seeking runaway wife. Name, Rachel Mary Carter, 26 years old. Dark hair, brown eyes, scar on her neck. Absconded from her lawful husband in March. Information leading to her return will be rewarded. Direct responses to Albert Carter, Wall Street, New York City. The letter passed from hand to hand. In 2 days the whole town knew, and in 3 days Rachel knew too. It was Mrs. Edith who broke the news. The 70-year-old lady arrived at Mrs. Amelia's house out of breath, hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the basket of eggs she was carrying. "Amelia!" she hollered from the road, not even climbing the steps. "Amelia, for the love of God!" Mrs. Amelia came out, wiping her hands on her apron. Rachel was on the porch, embroidering a towel for the blacksmith's wife. She looked up and saw the sheer panic on the old woman's face. "What is it, Edith?" "There's a letter, came for the sheriff, but the postmaster let Martha read it, and now the whole county knows. It's about Rachel. Her husband is hunting for her. There's reward money for anyone who talks." The embroidery hoop slipped from Rachel's hands. The needle stuck into the floorboards. The world tilted on its axis. She tried to stand, but her legs refused to hold her. She slumped back down, heavy, her heart hammering so violently it battered her ribs. Mrs. Amelia bounded up the steps and knelt in front of Rachel. "Breathe, child, look at me, breathe." But Rachel couldn't breathe. Her throat had closed entirely, not from mutism, but from pure, blinding panic. He had found her. After 7 months, he had found her. Albert never forgot, never forgave. He had sworn, the last time he wrapped his hands around her throat, that if she ever tried to leave, he would track her down to the gates of hell. Mrs. Edith climbed the steps, wheezing. "The letter don't say he knows she's here," she explained hurriedly, "just that he's looking across the country. Probably sent flyers to sheriffs in 10 different states. But Amelia, there are folks in this town who'd sell their own mother for a silver dollar. If there's a reward, nobody is turning anyone in." Mrs. Amelia cut her off, her voice like steel. "Not while I draw breath." But Rachel could barely hear her. She was back in that night, her last night in New York. Albert coming home drunk, reeking of cheap whiskey and another woman's perfume. She had asked him where he'd been. A fatal mistake. He had grabbed her by the neck, squeezing, until the edges of her vision went black, until she was certain she was going to die right there on the parlor floor. He let go at the very last second and said, with a terrifyingly calm voice, "If you ever try to leave me, I'll kill you. Simple as that. I will find you, and I will kill you." Rachel stumbled to her feet. She ran inside, into her small room, dragged out her trunk, started throwing clothes into her battered leather suitcase. Her hands were shaking so violently she dropped more than she packed. Mrs. Amelia rushed in after her. "What do you think you're doing?" Rachel grabbed her notebook with trembling hands and scribbled, "I have to run before he gets here, before someone tells him where I am." "You aren't going anywhere," Mrs. Amelia said firmly, wrestling the suitcase away from her. "Listen to me. That man has no right to you. What he did is a crime. You are safe here. We won't let him take you." Rachel wrote, her handwriting jagged with desperation. "He will kill me. He promised. Not if we don't let him anywhere near you." But Rachel didn't believe it. She knew Albert, knew his relentless pride, his cruelty, his absolute certainty that she was his property, papers signed in a church, vows spoken before God. In his mind, she was his until death. Running away was theft, and he always collected his debts. Mrs. Edith appeared in the doorway. "Amelia, folks are gathering at the general store trying to figure out what to do." The two older women stepped out. Rachel sat on the edge of her bed, pulling her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth. She wanted to scream, but no sound would come. She wanted to cry, but her tears were frozen. She was trapped in a loop of terror, reliving every punch, every shove, every venomous word Albert had spat at her over 5 years of marriage. That was when she heard the sound of a horse outside. The panic exploded. It was him. He was already here. He had found out. Rachel threw herself onto the floor, scrambled underneath the bed, and pressed herself flat against the wall. Dust filled her nose, but she didn't sneeze, didn't move. She lay there shivering, waiting for his heavy boots to kick the door open, waiting for his cruel hands to drag her out by her hair. But the voice she heard wasn't his. "Mrs. Hayes, is Rachel here?" "Matthew." Rachel heard the older woman's footsteps. "She is, but she's in a bad way, Matthew. She heard about the letter." "I know. The whole town knows. That's why I'm here." Silence. Then Mrs. Amelia's voice, hushed. "And what do you aim to do?" "Help, if she'll let me." Footsteps approached the bedroom. Rachel curled into a tighter ball, trying to make herself disappear. The door opened. She saw Mrs. Amelia's sensible shoes and Matthew's dusty boots standing further back in the hallway. "Rachel," Mrs. Amelia called softly. "Matthew is here. He wants to talk to you. Will you let him?" Rachel didn't answer, didn't move. "Is she under the bed?" Matthew asked quietly. "Yes." Matthew was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Rachel, I'm not going to come into the room. I'm going to stand right here in the hall. But I need you to listen to me. Can you do that?" Silence. "I'll take that as a yes. Look, I know you are terrified. I know that man hurt you deeply. I know he swore to find you. But he cannot take you, not if you don't want to go." Rachel squeezed her eyes shut. Wanting didn't matter. Albert didn't care what she wanted. "I spoke with the sheriff," Matthew continued. "Explained the situation. He said if this man shows up, he can't just drag you off. You have the right to say you won't go back, that he abused you, that you fear for your life." But Rachel knew that the law on paper was very different from the law in practice. Albert had money, he had influence, and he had a marriage certificate that declared her his lawful wedded wife. "I will not let him hurt you," Matthew said. His voice was steady as a rock. "I promise you, and I do not break my promises." Rachel opened her eyes. She looked at his boots in the hallway. Worn leather work boots, stained with Ohio dirt. Boots that had never kicked her, that had never stepped over her when she was bleeding on the floor, and she wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly. Slowly, very slowly, she began to crawl out from under the bed. Mrs. Amelia knelt and helped her up. When Rachel was on her feet, covered in dust, her hair a mess, her eyes red, she looked out into the hallway. Matthew was leaning against the far wall, a good 10 feet away. His arms were crossed over his chest, not out of impatience, but as if he needed to hold himself back. His face was grave, his eyes etched with worry. When he saw her, he relaxed just a fraction. "Hi," he said simply. Rachel picked up the notebook from her nightstand, wrote with trembling fingers, "He will kill me." Matthew read it when Mrs. Amelia turned the book toward him. He shook his head. "He won't. Not if I have anything to say about it." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you trust me?" Rachel stood frozen, her pencil hovering over the paper. Did she? Could she? After everything, after 5 years of learning that trusting a man was just an invitation for pain, could she risk it? She looked at him. At the way he kept his distance, at the way he had never forced anything on her, at the months of patience, of gentle kindness, of respect, at the letters they traded where he laid his heart bare and never once judged hers. At the coffee he had accepted from her hands as if it were the Holy Grail. She wrote, "I am trying." Matthew read it, and something in his face softened completely. "That's all I ask," he said. Then he laid out his offer. "You can come stay at my farm if you'd like. It's a big house, plenty of rooms. You'd have a bedroom with a sturdy lock on the door. I sleep on the opposite side of the house. Hattie, my cook, lives there too. You would never be alone with me. And the farm is far from town, high up on the ridge. If anyone comes looking, we'll see them a mile off." Rachel processed this. He was offering a fortress, protection. But also, she wrote, "People will talk. A lone woman living with a widower." Matthew shrugged. "Let them talk. I care a whole lot more about keeping you breathing than I do about town gossip. But if it worries you, Mrs. Hayes can come too. There's room for everyone." Mrs. Amelia chimed in. "I most certainly will." "I'm not leaving this girl's side." "Then it's settled," Matthew said. "You're moving up there this afternoon. I'll fetch the wagon to load your things. And Rachel, one more thing. I own a Winchester rifle. I don't care to use it. Didn't even use it when a cougar took 3 of my calves last winter. But if that man shows up trying to put his hands on you, I will pull the trigger." The brutal honesty of his words hit Rachel squarely in the chest. He would kill for her. A man who wouldn't even shoot a predator to protect his livestock would use a gun to protect her. She wrote, "I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Matthew read it and smiled. A small, sad smile. "Then we have something in common, because I don't want you getting hurt either." And it was in that exact moment that Rachel felt it. Not love, not quite yet, but something shifting deep within her ribs, something warm that she thought had turned to ash long ago. Gratitude, yes, but also the fragile beginnings of affection, of genuine care for another human being. She nodded, just a single nod. Matthew understood. "All right, I'll go hitch the wagon. Be back in an hour." And he was gone. He walked down the steps, swung onto his horse, and rode off in a cloud of dust. Rachel stood in the hallway, clutching the notebook to her chest. Mrs. Amelia placed a warm hand on her shoulder. "You're going to be all right, child. That man will not let an ounce of harm come to you." Rachel looked out the window at the dirt road where Matthew had disappeared, and she finally allowed herself to believe it. An hour later, Matthew returned with a large wagon hitched to 2 draft horses. He brought Hattie with him, a 50-year-old black woman, sturdy and sharp-eyed, with a warm, booming laugh. "Miss Rachel," she greeted warmly, "heard all about you. It'll be a blessing to have some female company up at the house. Mr. Matthew is a fine boss, but he talks about as much as a fence post, only ever discusses the crops and the weather." Matthew rolled his eyes but didn't argue. He helped load Mrs. Amelia's trunks and Rachel's worn suitcase. He placed everything in the wagon with care. Rachel climbed up and sat in the back bench next to Mrs. Amelia. Hattie sat up front with Matthew, who took the reins. The ride up to the farm took 40 minutes. They left the town behind, taking a winding dirt road that climbed up into the hills. Endless rows of corn and wheat flanked them on both sides. A bright blue sky overhead, dotted with fat white clouds. The scent of sweetgrass and rich soil filled the air. Rachel observed everything. She observed Matthew most of all, the way he guided the horses, firm but gentle, the way he kept his eyes on the road, alert and steady. Every so often he would glance over his shoulder, just checking to see if she was all right. He didn't speak, honoring her silence. He just checked on her. Willow Creek Farm appeared after a sharp bend, a large 2-story farmhouse made of timber and stone, painted white with slate-blue shutters. a wide wraparound porch in the front with a hanging swing. Surrounding it were the fields, pastures dotted with cattle, a massive red barn, a chicken coop, and a large vegetable garden. Further off, near the tree line, sat the bunkhouse where the hired hands lived. "It's beautiful up here," Mrs. Amelia commented. "Laura painted the shutters blue," Matthew said quietly. "Said blue kept the bad luck away." They climbed down. Matthew showed them the house, a wide parlour with dark, sturdy furniture, a cracked but comfortable leather sofa, a massive dining table that seated 10. A sprawling kitchen in the back with a cast-iron stove, a fully stocked pantry, and a window overlooking the garden. And the bedrooms. 4 in total. Matthew showed them 2 of them on the right side of the house, one for Rachel, one for Mrs. Amelia. "My room is over there," he pointed to the far opposite side of the hall, "and that last one I just use for storing seed and tools." Rachel looked at his closed door. She accepted the arrangement without question. Hattie, ever practical, started unloading the kitchen supplies. Matthew helped with the heavy bags. Rachel stood on the porch, taking it all in. The farm had a commanding view. From up here you could see the rolling valley, the tiny town below, and the winding road leading up. You could spot anyone approaching miles away. He was right. It was a fortress. That afternoon, once everything was settled, Matthew called his ranch hands together. There were 4 of them. John, a 30-year-old married man who lived in a small cabin down the ridge with his wife Clara. Peter and Anthony, brothers in their early 20s. And Sebastian, a 60-year-old veteran who had worked the land since before Matthew was even born. Matthew laid it out plain. "There is a man who might come looking for Miss Rachel. He is a dangerous man. If anyone comes around town asking questions about a new woman, dark hair, brown eyes, you boys don't know a damn thing. Are we clear?" The 4 men nodded solemnly. John asked, "What if he rides up here to the property, boss?" "We don't let him within 50 yards of her. John, you and Peter will take shifts keeping an eye on the access road. You see anything out of the ordinary, you raise the alarm." "And if he brings the law with him?" Sebastian asked, rubbing his grey beard. "A husband's got legal rights to his wife, Matthew." "He doesn't have the right to beat her half to death," Matthew replied coldly. "And if the sheriff shows up, we show him the proof. Miss Rachel has scars on her neck. She has marks. That is proof enough." Rachel, who was listening to everything through the open kitchen window, instinctively touched her neck, the thin, silvery scars where Albert's fingers had dug in so deeply the skin remembered it forever. She always hid them with scarves, with high collars, with shame. But Matthew was right. It was proof of the hell she had survived. Days slipped into a rhythm. Rachel adapted to life on the farm. She woke up at dawn to the rooster crowing, helped Hattie in the kitchen, mended clothes and took on sewing commissions Mrs. Amelia brought up from town, wrote her letters, walked through the garden, and she watched Matthew. He worked from sun-up to sundown, out in the fields, in the barn, mending fences, tending the herd. He would come back to the house covered in dirt, sweating, exhausted, but he always paused on the porch, looked to see if she was there, and told her good evening. He didn't approach, just acknowledged her existence, and Rachel began to acknowledge his too. She started noticing the details, the way he chuckled quietly when old Sebastian spun a tall tale, the patient way he taught young Peter how to mend a leather harness, the way he handled his livestock with authority but never cruelty, the way he spoke of his late wife with deep sorrow but no bitterness. One night, 2 weeks after moving to the farm, Rachel did something brave. She brewed a pot of coffee, poured a cup, and carried it out to the porch where Matthew was sitting on the swing, staring out at the stars. He turned his head when he heard her footsteps. Surprise washed over his face. "For me?" he asked, pointing to the cup. Rachel nodded. "Thank you." He took it, careful not to brush her fingers. He took a sip, sighed in pure satisfaction. "You make coffee just as good as Hattie." Rachel didn't walk away. She stood there, anchored about 10 feet from him, looking out at the stars, too. "You can sit if you'd like," Matthew offered, gesturing to the rocking chair on the far side of the porch. "I promise I don't bite." She hesitated, but she sat, perched on the very edge of the seat, tense, ready to bolt. But she sat. They sat in silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, it was a shared one. Two tired adults, bruised by life, just existing in the same space without demanding a single thing from one another. After about 10 minutes, Matthew spoke, not necessarily to her, just spoke aloud. "When Laura died, I didn't think I was going to make it. It hurt so damn much I just wanted to go into the ground with her. I spent months just doing the bare minimum. Work, eat, sleep. Sometimes not even that. The boys had to force food down my throat or I would have starved myself." Rachel looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was still watching the stars. "But then one day, I woke up and realized the sun had come up again, and that I had survived another night, and that maybe, just maybe, I could survive one more, and then another, until one day I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living again, not like before. It's never going to be like before. But it was a life." He took another sip of his coffee. "Life insists on moving forward, doesn't it? Even when we're dead sure it's over." Rachel recognized her own words, the ones she had written to him in that letter months ago, and she understood. He was telling her that he survived, that she was going to survive too, that pain isn't permanent even when it feels like it's carved into your bones. She picked up her notebook, wrote by the faint starlight, "Do you still love her?" Matthew read it when she turned the page toward him. He smiled, sad but true. "I do, always will. She was the first great love of my life. But she's gone. And I'm still here. And I learned that it's possible to love someone who's passed on, and still have room left in your heart for other things. I don't know if I have room for more romantic love, but I have room for friendship, for caring about someone, for hope." He looked at Rachel then, right into her eyes. "What I'm trying to say, probably making a mess of it because I ain't a poet, is that you don't need to be afraid that I expect something from you. I don't. You are here because you're in danger and because I want to help you. Nothing more. If someday you ever want it to be more, then we can talk about it, but only if you want to, on your time." Rachel felt her eyes well up with tears. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever given her a choice. Albert dictated everything. When to marry, where to live, when to share a bed, when she could leave the house, when she had to stay. She was his living doll, no voice, no will of her own. And now, this man was telling her that the time was hers, the choice was hers, the power was hers. She wrote, "Thank you for everything." "You're welcome," Matthew replied softly. He finished his coffee. "Well, I ought to turn in. Gotta be up before dawn to milk the cows. Good night, Rachel." "Good night," she wrote back. He went inside. She stayed out on the porch a while longer, looking up at the stars, feeling the foundation of her soul beginning to rebuild itself. If you are enjoying this story so far, leave a like to help me out, and share it with someone who also loves stories about overcoming the odds and finding true love. 3 weeks at the farm, and Rachel was different. Not healed, not whole, but different. She was sleeping soundly through the night. The nightmares still visited, but with much less frequency. She was eating more. She even put on a little weight, the hollows of her cheeks filling out. She laughed at Hattie's boisterous jokes. She helped Mrs. Amelia harvest the garden, and she watched Matthew. He remained unfailingly patient. He never pushed for closeness, but he was always there, a steady, comforting presence. When Rachel sewed on the porch, he would sit on the other side, oiling a saddle or whittling. When she walked through the vegetable patch in the late afternoon, he would happen to be there, watering the tomatoes. Never intrusive, just present. And the notes continued. They left them on the parlor sideboard now. Rachel asked about the farm, about his work, about his life. Matthew answered with a brutal honesty she had come to treasure. No half-truths, no sugarcoating, just the plain truth. She told him more about her marriage, about how Albert changed the moment they took their vows, about the first time he hit her, 3 months into the marriage, a backhand across the face because the roast was too dry. She had wept. He had begged for forgiveness on his knees, promising it would never happen again. That promise lasted exactly 2 weeks. Matthew read that and wrote back, "A man who strikes a woman is no man at all. He is a coward." Rachel kept that note. Another day, she asked, "Did you never want to remarry after Laura passed?" He answered, "I thought I didn't. I thought love was a one-time deal, but lately I've been thinking differently." She didn't ask what made him change his mind. She was terrified of the answer. She was terrified that the answer was her. Because if it was her, she'd have to figure out what to do with that information, and she still wasn't ready. A month on the farm. October bled into November. The air grew crisp. The autumn harvest was in full swing. Matthew spent even more time out in the fields, calculating yields, racing against the first frost. Rachel would sometimes walk out with him. She didn't speak, just walked by his side. Matthew explained things even without her asking. "Look at the color of this wheat. Means it's prime for threshing. Next week is going to be back-breaking work. I've hired extra hands from town to help bring it all in." Rachel wrote, "Can I help?" "You?" He looked genuinely surprised. "It's grueling labor, cold winds, standing on your feet all day. Your hands will get blistered to all hell." She insisted, "I want to help. I feel useless just sitting and sewing." "You aren't useless, but if you want to pitch in, you can. Just don't push yourself too hard." And she loved that. She loved that he let her choose. He didn't decree what she could or couldn't do. 2 days later, news arrived from town. John rode up the trail, his face tight with worry. "Boss, I need a word." Matthew dropped his pitchfork. "Speak." "There's a fellow asking questions down at the saloon. Came in on the morning train. Rented a room at the boarding house. He's asking if anyone's seen a woman matching a certain description, flashing a thick roll of bills for anyone who points him the right way." Matthew's blood ran cold. "Does the description match Miss Rachel?" "To a T." "Did anyone talk?" Old man Jenkins from the store looked mighty tempted. He's deep in debt to the bank, and that money would bail him out. But Mrs. Tessa gave him a dressing down right there in front of God and everybody. Told him any man who turns a woman over to a beating is worse than Judas Iscariot. Far as I know, nobody's spilled, but the fellow is still down there, buying rounds and asking questions. "Damn it," Matthew muttered. He hadn't expected it to happen so fast. He thought they'd have more time. "Does Rachel know?" "No, sir, I rode straight here to tell you." "Good, we'll tell her calmly. Don't want to send her into a panic." He took a deep breath. "John, you and Peter double the watch on the road. Anything moves that ain't supposed to, you fire a warning shot, and pass the word down to the boys in town. Nobody confirms a damn thing to this man. Nobody." "Yes, boss." Matthew walked into the house. Rachel was in the kitchen with Hattie peeling potatoes. The moment she saw his face, she knew. The terror that had receded came rushing back like a tidal wave. She grabbed her notebook, her hands shaking violently. "Is he here?" Matthew nodded grimly. "He's down in town asking around, but nobody has said a word, and they aren't going to." But Rachel didn't believe that. She knew the power of money. She knew human greed. Someone would talk. It was only a matter of time. "I have to leave," she wrote. "If I run, he won't bring trouble to your door." "You aren't going anywhere," Matthew said, his voice hard and absolute. "I told you I was going to protect you, and that is exactly what I'm going to do. But what if he comes up here? What if he hurts you?" "He won't lay a finger on me. And even if he tries, I'm not alone. I have 4 grown men working this land. We have the sheriff. We have half the town standing behind us." "And the other half?" Rachel wrote. Matthew hesitated. He didn't lie to her. "The other half doesn't care, but not caring is a far cry from actively betraying you to a monster. I know this town. They might not stick their necks out to defend you, but they won't sell you out either." Rachel desperately wanted to believe him, but her fear was a much louder voice than logic. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay stiff in her bed, listening to every creak of the house, the wind rattling the window panes. An owl hooting in the distance, a horse stamping in the barn. Every sound was Albert arriving, his heavy boots stomping up the porch steps, his fists pounding on the front door. At 2 in the morning, she gave up. She threw a shawl over her nightgown and stepped out into the hallway. The house was dark and silent. She was heading toward the kitchen for a glass of water when she saw a faint glow coming from the parlor. Matthew was there, sitting in his late wife's rocking chair. His Winchester rifle laid flat across his lap, his eyes wide open, keeping watch in the dark. When he saw Rachel, he didn't jump. "Can't sleep either?" he asked quietly. She nodded. He patted the empty armchair next to him. "Come on, we'll keep watch together." Rachel hesitated. She looked at the rifle, looked at him, at his exhausted but fiercely determined eyes, and she sat down. They sat in the quiet dark. After a long while, Matthew spoke. "I will not let him take you. I need you to believe that." She took the notebook she had carried with her, wrote by the dim light of the dying hearth. "Why do you care so much? I am nobody to you." Matthew read it. He looked up at her. His eyes were as dark as the night outside, but there was a fire burning in them, something she still couldn't put a name to. "You aren't nobody," he said slowly. "You are." He paused, searching for the right words. "You are someone who reminded me that I am still alive, that I can still feel something besides grief and emptiness. I don't know what to call it yet. I don't know if it's love. It feels too early to call it love. But it is something, and that something is the most important thing in the world to me." Rachel felt her heart race, not from fear, from something entirely different. She wrote, "I feel something too, but I am terrified. I know, and I won't rush you. It could take years. It could take the rest of our lives. I will wait." "No." "Why?" "Because you are worth it." 4 words, 4 simple words that shattered the last of her defenses, because no one had ever told her that. No one had ever believed she was worth anything at all, let alone patience, let alone waiting a lifetime for. A tear slipped down her cheek, then another. Soon she was weeping silently, her shoulders shaking with the force of it. Matthew didn't move to hold her. He didn't try to smother her tears. He just sat there, steady as an oak. He just said, "It's all right to cry. You've been holding it in for a long time." And she cried. She cried for everything, for 5 years of living in hell, for the scars that marked her body and her soul, for the voice that had been stolen from her, for the bright, hopeful girl she had been before Albert, a girl who was never coming back. But she also cried out of profound relief, because for the first time in years, she wasn't facing the darkness alone. When the tears finally subsided, she was utterly exhausted. She looked at Matthew. He was still sitting there, patiently waiting. She wrote, "Thank you for waiting." "Always," he replied. But their fragile peace was about to be shattered faster than either of them anticipated, because the very next day, Albert Carter rode up to Willow Creek Farm. It was high noon when John came sprinting up from the access road. "Boss!" he bellowed before he even reached the yard. "Someone's coming up the ridge. Rented buggy. Ain't from around here." Matthew was in the barn. He dropped his tools and bolted outside. "How many?" "Just one, but he's making a beeline straight for the house." Rachel. Matthew's first thought was Rachel. He crossed the yard in long strides and burst into the house. Rachel was in the parlor with Mrs. Amelia, doing needlework. When she saw the look on his face, the needle dropped from her fingers. "He's coming," Matthew said. "But you are going to go to your room. Lock the door. I will handle this." Rachel stood up, absolute terror hijacking her features. She began to shake violently. Mrs. Amelia grabbed her arm. "Easy now, child. We ain't going to let anything happen." But Rachel couldn't hear her. The room was spinning. He had found her. After everything, after 7 months of looking over her shoulder, he had found her. And now he was going to drag her back to hell. Matthew stepped closer. 2 steps. Stopped. "Rachel, look at me." She forced her eyes up. "I promised I would protect you, and I will. But I need you to trust me right now. Go to your room, lock the door, and do not come out for any reason. Let me deal with him." Rachel wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. But she knew Albert. She knew his explosive violence, his cruelty, his relentless stubbornness. If he wanted something, he took it. He always took it. But she looked into Matthew's eyes, the eyes that had never lied to her, and she nodded. Mrs. Amelia practically carried her to the bedroom. Rachel stumbled inside and heard the heavy deadbolt slide shut from the outside. She stood there, her back pressed against the wood, her heart hammering so hard she felt physically sick. She tried to draw a breath. She couldn't. Her throat had closed shut like a vice. Outside, Matthew rallied his men, John, Peter, Anthony, and Sebastian. They all grabbed whatever they could. Peter held a shotgun. John grabbed a machete. Anthony and Sebastian held heavy pitchforks and axes. They weren't soldiers, but they looked the part. "Nobody lays a hand on her," Matthew commanded. "Understood? If he tries to push past us, we stop him. Put him in the dirt if you have to, but don't kill him. Just stop him." "And if he brings the law back with him?" Anthony asked nervously. "Then we show them the truth, the scars, the terror. No righteous judge is going to force a woman back into the arms of a man who tried to murder her." Matthew picked up his Winchester, checked the chamber, prayed to God he wouldn't have to pull the trigger. He stepped out onto the porch. The 4 ranch hands took their positions, 2 on either side of the wooden steps. Matthew stood dead center, alone, the rifle resting casually but dangerously across his forearms. The buggy rounded the bend. A tired rental horse pulling a dust-caked carriage. It rolled to a halt right in front of the house. A man stepped down. Albert Carter was 45 but looked a decade older. A thick waistline, a face flushed red from years of hard liquor and bad temper. His expensive city clothes were wrinkled and stained with travel dust. His dark mustache was neatly trimmed, but his eyes were small, hard, and mean. He surveyed the farmhouse, the armed men, and finally locked eyes with Matthew. "Afternoon," Albert called out, his voice feigning politeness but dripping with arrogant entitlement. "Is this Willow Creek Farm?" "It is," Matthew answered, not moving an inch. "Can I help you?" "My name is Albert Carter. I've traveled all the way from New York looking for my runaway wife. I have it on good authority that she might be hiding out here." "Your authority is mistaken," Matthew said flatly. "There are no New York women here." Albert smiled. "It was an ugly, predatory thing. Now, there's no need to lie, farmer. I know she's in that house, paid good money to find out. A woman at the boarding house down in town told me she saw a girl matching my wife's description ride up this very hill about a month ago. Said she came with an older woman, Amelia Hayes, who, I'm told, is also currently residing here." Matthew's grip tightened on the rifle. "Who told you that?" "Doesn't matter. What matters is that I am here to collect what belongs to me. My wife ran off, caused me a great deal of distress and public embarrassment. I'm here to take her home. She's not going anywhere, Matthew said simply. What do you mean she's not going? Albert took a step toward the stairs, the 4 ranch hands tensed, raising their weapons an inch. She is my legal wife. We were married in a church. I have the papers to prove it. She has a legal and moral obligation to return with me. She has an obligation to stay alive, Matthew shot back, and that ain't going to happen if she goes back with you. Albert stopped. His face flushed a deeper, angrier red. Watch your tongue, boy. You don't know me. You know nothing about my marriage. I know enough. I know you beat her. I know you wrapped your hands around her throat until she passed out. I know she carries scars that she will take to her grave. That is a crime. Albert laughed. A harsh, barking sound without a shred of humor. A crime is a wife abandoning her husband. A crime is adultery. A crime is breaking holy vows made before God Almighty. And you, harboring another man's lawful wife, you could be charged with complicity. You think about that? Matthew took 1 step forward, closing the distance to the edge of the porch. I have. And I don't give a damn. Because the law you're talking about is just ink on paper. The real crime is what you did to her. I never did a damn thing to her, Albert exploded, stepping up onto the first stair. I put a roof over her head. I fed her, clothed her, and she repays me by sneaking out like a thief in the night, without so much as a goodbye note. You think that's right? Rachel heard every word from inside her locked room. Each syllable was a knife to the gut, because she knew this routine. This was the version of the story where Albert was the victim, where she was the ungrateful, hysterical wife. He always spun it this way to the neighbors, to the doctors, to her family, and people believed him. They always believed the distinguished gentleman. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the door open and tell the world the truth, but her voice wouldn't come. Just like always, the silence trapped her. Outside, Matthew didn't flinch. She ran because she was terrified you were going to murder her. Does that tell you anything? She's insane, Albert bellowed, dropping the polite facade entirely. She was always prone to dramatics. Every normal marital disagreement turned into a Greek tragedy with her. Normal marital disagreements do not leave finger-shaped bruises on a woman's neck. She fell down the stairs, the lie snapped out with practiced ease. She was clumsy, always tripping over her own feet. I even tried to fetch a doctor for her, but she refused. Matthew stared down at the man on the steps. He saw through the slick lie. He saw how rehearsed it was, how many times Albert must have used that exact excuse to explain away black eyes and bruised ribs. How many people had he manipulated with that story? You are not taking her, Matthew said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. You can get back in that buggy and ride away right now, or I can put you in the ground. Your choice. Albert looked at the men flanking the stairs. He did the math. He was vastly outnumbered and outgunned, but he was an arrogant man, accustomed to bending the world to his will. This isn't over, he snarled, pointing a thick finger at Matthew. I'm going to the sheriff. I'm going to a judge. I have legal rights, signed papers. She is coming back with me, whether she wants to or not. Then go, Matthew challenged. Go talk to whoever you want. But she doesn't leave this property until a judge looks her in the eye, listens to her story, sees the scars you gave her, and tells her she has to go. And I promise you, there ain't a judge in this state who'd condemn her to that. She doesn't even talk, Albert screamed, his voice cracking with rage. She's a mute. How's she going to tell a judge anything? Silence fell over the yard. Matthew tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. How do you know she doesn't talk? Albert realized his fatal mistake instantly. He scrambled to cover it up. I always knew. She's always been that way. Liar, Matthew spat. She wasn't born that way. She became that way because of you, and that silence is better proof of what you did than any scar on her body. Albert opened his mouth, then closed it. He searched for a clever retort and found nothing. Humiliated, he backed down the stairs. "This is far from over," he growled. "I'll be back. With the law. With a judge. With the National Guard if I have to. She belongs to me." "She belongs to no one," Matthew corrected him coldly. "She belongs to herself." Albert climbed back into the rented buggy. Before he snapped the reins, he glared up at the farmhouse, up at the second-story windows where he guessed Rachel was hiding. "You'll pay for this," he screamed at the house. "You hear me? You will pay." He whipped the horse furiously and tore off down the road, kicking up a massive cloud of angry red dust. Matthew didn't lower his rifle until the buggy was entirely out of sight. When he finally did, his hands were shaking with adrenaline. John clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You handled him well, boss." But Matthew didn't feel well. He felt sick to his stomach, because he had dealt with men like Albert before, entitled, vicious men who viewed women as property. And those men never, ever just walked away. He went back inside. Mrs. Amelia was hovering in the hallway. "The poor girl is in shock," she whispered. "She's shaking like a leaf." Matthew knocked softly on the bedroom door. "Rachel? It's me. You can open it." Silence. Then the heavy scrape of the deadbolt sliding back. The door creaked open. Rachel stood there, pale as a ghost, her eyes wide and panicked, a sheen of cold sweat on her forehead. She looked at him. She opened her mouth, desperately trying to form words, but nothing came out. Frustration and terror warred on her face. Matthew took one slow step inside, telegraphing every movement so he wouldn't spook her. "He's gone," he said gently. "He didn't take you. You are safe." But Rachel didn't feel safe, because she knew Albert. He was going to come back, with the sheriff, with a judge, with a legal mandate dragging her back to New York. And then what? All of Matthew's courage and patience wouldn't matter against the crushing weight of the law. The law always sided with the husband. Always. Her knees buckled. She collapsed forward. Matthew moved on pure instinct, catching her before she hit the floorboards. It was the first time he had truly touched her, the first time their bodies had made real contact beyond grazing fingers over a coffee cup. Rachel went rigid for a split second. The panic spiked. But then she registered the touch. Matthew's arms were strong but incredibly gentle. They held her up. They didn't cage her in. He smelled like sweetgrass, coffee and clean sweat, not whiskey and violent rage. She melted against him. And then the dam broke. She began to sob, huge, silent, heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. Matthew lowered them both to the floor, cradling her as she wept. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't try to fix it. He just held her securely while she fell apart. When the sobs finally quieted, Rachel was entirely drained. She tilted her head up, looked at Matthew's face, so close to hers. She saw the deep worry etched in his features. She saw the fierce, protective care. And she saw that other thing, the thing she was still too terrified to put a name to. She grabbed her notebook, which had fallen to the floor. She wrote with a violently trembling hand, "He will come back. He will take me away." Matthew read it. He shook his head, his jaw set in stone. "Not while I still have air in my lungs. The law is on his side. Then we fight the law. We make such a damn uproar that the law won't have a choice but to back down. How? We expose him. We show everyone what he did to you, the scars, the abuse. We turn it into such a massive public scandal that no judge in their right mind will want to be seen siding with a monster. We use the town. We fight." Rachel wanted to believe him, but life had taught her that fighting a wealthy, powerful man was like trying to punch the wind. Matthew saw the absolute defeat in her eyes. He lifted his hands and gently, very carefully, cupped her face. It was a bold move, but he needed her to hear him. He looked directly into her tear-filled brown eyes. "I am not giving up on you. Do you understand me? I am not. It might take time. It might be the hardest thing we ever do. But I am not backing down." And it was in that moment, staring into his fierce, unyielding eyes, that Rachel knew. She loved him. She had no idea when it had happened. Maybe it was the first time she brought him coffee, or the first letter they exchanged, or the nights he stood guard over her, or the endless months of his quiet patience. But it had happened. She loved this man who had waited months just for her to feel safe. This man who asked for absolutely nothing in return, who only ever gave. She tried to tell him. She opened her mouth. The words were right there, resting on her tongue, but her throat locked tight. Like always. Like always. Hot, bitter frustration burned in her eyes. A fresh tear spilled over her lashes. Matthew wiped it away with his thumb. "You don't have to say it," he whispered gently. "I know. Me too." And she understood. He loved her too. He had just confessed it without saying the words, and he was willing to wait for her. Months, years, forever, if that's what it took. The following days were a powder keg. Albert didn't return immediately, but the threat of him hung over the farm like a dark cloud. Matthew sent John down into town to hold a meeting, to gather the locals, explain the brutal reality of the situation, and ask for their backing. The town's response was nothing short of miraculous. Mrs. Tessa was the first to stand up in the church hall. "I saw the marks on that poor girl's neck the day she arrived," she testified to the crowd. "That wasn't no tumble down the stairs. Those were the hands of a violent man. I will not lift a finger to help the devil drag her back to hell." Mrs. Edith slammed her cane on the floor in agreement. "She's been writing letters for half this county without asking for a dime. She taught my granddaughter how to read. She is one of ours now, and we protect our own." The Reverend, a grey-haired man of 60 who had seen the worst of humanity, threw the weight of the church behind them. "The covenant of marriage is sacred," he boomed from the pulpit. "But God does not bless a butcher. If that man laid hands on his wife, he broke those holy vows long before she ever ran. The church stands with Rachel." Even Mr. Jenkins, the indebted shopkeeper who had nearly sold her out, hung his head. "My own daughter takes beatings from her husband," he admitted, his voice thick with shame, "and I've been too much of a coward to stop it. If standing between this girl and her monster is a way to make up for my sins, then count me in." In 3 days, the entire county was mobilized. The vast majority stood firmly in Rachel's corner. Not everyone, of course. There were a few traditionalists who believed a wife's duty was absolute obedience, regardless of the cost. But they were a quiet, cowardly minority in the face of the town's unified fury. Matthew rode back to the farm with the news. "The town is with us," he told Rachel, a fierce smile breaking through his exhaustion. "If he comes back with the sheriff, there will be 50 people standing in the road ready to testify on your behalf." Rachel could hardly process it. These people barely knew her. She had helped them with small things, drafting a letter, fixing a hem, teaching them how to sign a document, and now they were willing to face down the law for her. She wrote, "Why? Why do they care?" Matthew read it and smiled softly. "Because you matter. Because almost everyone down there knows someone who suffered under a heavy hand, and they finally have a chance to do something about it." He stepped closer, dropping his voice. "But mostly because they see what I see. That you are a good person, that you deserve a chance at a happy life, and that you deserve to choose your own path." 2 weeks later, Albert returned, just as he promised. But he didn't come alone. He brought Sheriff Miller, a heavy-set 50-year-old man with a walrus mustache, and a slick-looking lawyer from Columbus, dressed in a sharp black suit and carrying a leather briefcase. The buggy pulled up to Willow Creek Farm. But this time, the yard wasn't empty. Half a dozen curious townsfolk had followed the buggy up the ridge, and standing strategically at the base of the porch stairs were 20 women, Mrs. Tessa, Mrs. Edith, Mrs. Amelia, the blacksmith's wife, the baker's wife, the town midwife, the schoolteacher, all standing shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, forming a silent, impenetrable wall of calico and righteous anger. Sheriff Miller stepped down from the buggy. He took one look at the barricade of furious women and sighed heavily. He knew this was going to be a nightmare. "Matthew," he called out, tipping his hat, "I've got a court order here demanding the return of Mrs. Rachel Carter to her lawful husband. Mr. Carter has all the necessary documents. It's a legally binding marriage. She has to come with us." "She's not going," Matthew replied, his voice echoing across the quiet yard. Same answer as before. "Matthew, don't make this harder than it needs to be. It's the law." "The law is dead wrong," Mrs. Tessa shouted from the front line, "and everyone standing here knows it." The lawyer from Columbus stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. His voice was reedy and irritating. "The law is the law, madam. It does not matter if you agree with it or not. Marriage is a legally binding contract. The wife must return to the marital home. Even if that home is a slaughterhouse?" The schoolteacher challenged. A sharp, respected woman of 30. "Even if returning means she'll end up in a pine box?" "There is absolutely no proof of abuse," the lawyer countered smoothly. "Then look at the proof," Matthew said, turning toward the house. "Rachel, can you step out here, just onto the porch? You don't have to come down the stairs." Total silence. Then the front door slowly creaked open. Rachel stepped out. She was trembling violently. Mrs. Amelia stood right beside her, an anchor in the storm. Rachel stopped at the edge of the porch railing. She looked down at the crowd, at the sheriff, at the slick lawyer, at Albert, who was glaring daggers but refusing to look her in the eye. Matthew looked up at her, his eyes full of unwavering support. "Can you show them?" he asked gently. Rachel hesitated. To show them meant exposing her deepest shame, exposing the brutal marks she had hidden for months. But she looked down at the women standing between her and her abuser, at their fierce, fiercely loyal faces, and she understood. This wasn't just for her. This was for all of them, for every woman who had ever been forced to suffer in silence. With trembling hands, she reached up and pulled down her high-lace collar. The scars were laid bare in the bright afternoon sun. Thin, silvery, unmistakable lines. The brutal imprint of a man's fingers, squeezed so tight and so often that her skin had permanently memorialized the violence. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Miller swallowed hard, looking physically ill. The lawyer frowned, suddenly looking unsure of his footing. Albert's face flushed a violent, guilty red, but he remained silent. "Did she get those falling down the stairs?" Matthew's voice cracked like a whip across the yard. "Does that look like an accident to you?" The lawyer tried to recover. "These marks, they could be self-inflicted. There are documented medical cases of hysterical women who—" The women exploded. "Hysterical? You coward! Liar!" Mrs. Tessa marched right up to the lawyer, jabbing a finger in his chest. "I saw this girl the day she rode into town. She weighed less than a sack of flour and had the eyes of a hunted deer. That ain't hysteria, mister. That's survival." If you've loved the story so far, hit that like button and share this video. It goes a long way in helping us bring more emotional stories to light. Sheriff Miller stared at the scars, at Rachel's utterly terrified eyes, at the mob of furious women, at Matthew standing on the porch with his hand resting near his holster, looking ready to go to war. The sheriff made his decision. "Mr. Carter," the lawman said, turning slowly to face the husband. "Did you put those marks on that woman's neck?" "No," Albert lied instantly. "I told you, she's clumsy. She fell." "Multiple falls that leave identical finger-shaped bruises wrapped around a windpipe?" the sheriff asked, his tone laced with disgust. "Do I look like a fool to you, sir?" Albert realized the tide had fully turned against him. He tried to pivot. Look, she is my wife. Sometimes a man has to discipline his household. It is a husband's God-given right to maintain order. Discipline, the sheriff repeated, his hand resting on his gun belt. By strangling her until she nearly dies? It was never that severe, Albert protested, panic bleeding into his voice. She exaggerates everything. She ain't exaggerating a damn thing, Mrs. Edith screamed from the crowd. My own granddaughter takes beatings from her man. I know exactly how this plays out. It starts with a shove, turns into a backhand, and ends with a man trying to choke the life out of you. That is not discipline, that is attempted murder. The lawyer tried desperately to regain control of the narrative. Ladies, please, this is a matter of civil law, not an emotional tribunal. It is entirely about emotion, the midwife fired back, a sturdy woman with iron-strong hands. Because it's about a human life, about a young woman who was nearly beaten to death and is fighting tooth and nail to recover. If you drag her back to New York, you are signing her death warrant, and her blood will be on your hands. Sheriff Miller rubbed his face wearily. He looked up at Rachel. Miss, do you want to return to New York with your husband? Rachel looked down at the lawman. Then she looked at Albert, who finally met her gaze. She saw the barely contained murderous rage in his eyes, the wounded pride of a man who realized his property was rebelling. And she saw exactly what her future would be if she climbed into that buggy. More punches, more screaming, more nights lying awake, waiting for the heavy thud of his boots, and eventually, inevitably, the final blow that would kill her. She opened her mouth, tried to speak the word. She couldn't. The wall of silence was still there, but the frustration was burning hotter than the fear now. She snatched her notebook from her apron pocket, uncapped her pen, and wrote in massive, furious letters, "No, I would rather die." Mrs. Amelia read the page out loud, her voice ringing across the farmyard. The sheriff nodded grimly. Her position is crystal clear. She refuses to go. But she is my lawful wife, Albert screamed, completely losing what was left of his composure. The papers dictate she belongs to me. She has to come back. A piece of paper doesn't supersede a woman's right to draw breath, the sheriff stated with absolute finality. Mr. Carter, I am going to ask you to get back in your buggy and return to New York. If you attempt to force this young woman into your carriage against her will, I will arrest you on the spot for attempted kidnapping. Kidnapping? She's my wife. A wife who is terrified of you and refuses to leave. Under my jurisdiction, that's kidnapping. Albert looked around wildly. At the sheriff who had turned his back on him, at his expensive, useless lawyer, at the wall of hostile, fiercely protective women, at the ranch hands gripping their weapons, at Matthew who hadn't spoken another word but stood there like an immovable mountain. And he realized it. He had lost, but his toxic pride wouldn't let him leave quietly. You will regret this, he spat, glaring up at Rachel with venomous hatred. You hear me? You embarrassed me. You cost me a fortune. You made me waste my time. You will bitterly regret this. Matthew took a deliberate step down the stairs. Is that a threat? Albert shrank back instantly. He looked at the taller, stronger, infinitely more dangerous man. No, he muttered, cowed, just stating facts. The fact is that you lost, Matthew said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm. Get off my land. And if I ever see your face in this state again, the sheriff won't have to worry about arresting you, because they'll be burying you. Albert scrambled into the buggy. The defeated lawyer followed suit. The driver cracked the whip, and the buggy spun around, racing back down the hill. And then something extraordinary happened. Rachel watched the buggy disappearing down the road. She watched the man who had stolen 5 years of her life fleeing like a coward. The man who had carved scars into her skin that would never fully fade. The man who had literally choked the voice out of her throat. and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, rage. A white-hot, magnificent rage accompanied by something infinitely more powerful. Freedom. She was free. Finally, unconditionally, beautifully free. And the anger she had swallowed for 5 agonizing years suddenly exploded out of her. She opened her mouth, and she screamed. It wasn't a word. It was just a sound, a raw, primal scream of rage and grief and absolute liberation. But it was a sound. Her sound. Her voice, tearing from her throat for the first time in 8 months. Down on the road, the buggy skidded to a halt for a split second. Albert looked back, his face a mask of shock. The entire crowd in the yard froze, staring up at Rachel. She was trembling from head to toe, one hand clutching her throat, her eyes wide with shock at her own action. A sound had come out. Matthew took the porch stairs 3 at a time. He stopped right in front of her, keeping his hands to himself, but standing close enough to catch her if she fell. "Rachel," he breathed, his eyes shining. You screamed." She looked up at him. Tears were streaming down her face. She tried again. She opened her mouth. The sound caught in her rusted vocal cords. She forced air past the barrier. "Ma." The muscles stiff from months of disuse fought her. "Matt, almost there." And then, "Matthew." It was a whisper. Rough, raspy, broken. But it was a real word. It was his name, falling from her lips. Matthew felt the hot sting of his own tears. "Rachel," he repeated, his voice cracking. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in his life. Rachel started laughing and sobbing at the exact same time. Her voice was back. Not perfectly, not entirely smooth. But the cage was open. She tried again, forcing the syllables out. "Ma-thew." 2 syllables, his full name. He couldn't hold back anymore. He opened his arms wide. He didn't grab her. He waited. He let her make the choice. Rachel looked at those strong, open arms, at the man who had waited, who had protected her, who had fought for her without ever demanding a single thing in return. And she took the step. She closed the distance and threw herself into his embrace. Matthew wrapped his arms around her, holding her tighter than he'd ever held anything in his life. She clung to his shirt, sobbing into his shoulder, fighting through the tears to force the words out. "Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome," he whispered into her hair, burying his face in her neck. "You're welcome, my love." Down in the yard, the crowd erupted, cheering, clapping, weeping openly. The women hugged each other in triumph. The men grinned, tossing their hats into the air. Even Sheriff Miller pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at his eyes. Far down the road, Albert witnessed it all. He saw his wife wrapped in the arms of a better man. He saw his utter, humiliating defeat. And for the first time, perhaps, the reality pierced his arrogance. He had lost her. Not today. He had lost her years ago, the very first time he raised his fist. He had just been too blind and arrogant to realize it until now. The buggy jerked forward, and this time it didn't look back. Rachel and Matthew stayed locked in that embrace on the porch for a very long time. When they finally pulled back, she looked up into his face, really looked at him, and for the first time since the day they met, since that rainy afternoon when he was fixing the roof, she smiled. It wasn't a tiny, fleeting smile. It was a radiant, breathtaking smile that lit up her entire face, that reached all the way to her brown eyes, that transformed the terrified, hunted girl into the vibrant woman she was always meant to be. Matthew saw that smile and knew. It was worth it. Every agonizing day of keeping his distance, every sleepless night standing guard, every single moment of painstaking patience. It was worth a lifetime of waiting just to see that smile. "You are so beautiful when you smile," he breathed. Rachel laughed. The sound was still gravelly, but it was joyous. Yea, you too, she managed to force out. He reached up and gently touched her cheek, asking permission with his eyes. She didn't flinch away. She leaned her face into his rough palm. "Can I kiss you?" Matthew asked, his voice barely a whisper. Rachel hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was a massive leap. But she looked into his eyes. The same eyes that had watched over her in the dark, and she nodded. The kiss was incredibly gentle, chaste, almost reverent, just their lips pressing together. But it held more power than any fiery, passionate embrace. It meant choice. It meant safety. It meant a new beginning. When they parted, Rachel was crying again. But these were good tears. Tears of profound relief, of overwhelming happiness, of hope. "I love you." She forced the words past the lingering tightness in her throat, fighting for each syllable, but saying them. Matthew wiped a tear from his own cheek. "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." And right there, on the porch of a farmhouse, high on an Ohio ridge, with half the town cheering in the yard below, two broken hearts began the beautiful, messy process of healing together. The following months were a season of transformation. Rachel practiced speaking every single day, with Hattie while baking bread in the kitchen, with Mrs. Amelia out in the garden, with Matthew on the porch swing at night. In the beginning it was exhausting. The words would jam in her throat, coming out stuttered or wrong. But day by day it got easier. Her throat remembered how to function. Her voice returned, growing stronger with every sunset. 6 months after the confrontation, she was speaking in full, fluid sentences. She still locked up occasionally if she was startled or deeply stressed, but she could speak, and to her it was nothing short of a miracle. Matthew asked her to marry him on a warm June evening. There was no grand spectacle. Just the two of them sitting on the porch swing, watching the fireflies dance in the fields, exactly as they did every night. He reached over, took her hand in his, and asked simply, "Will you marry me?" Rachel looked at him, at the man who had saved her life, who had waited for her to heal at her own pace, who had loved her unconditionally when she was incapable of loving even herself. And she answered clearly, without a single stutter, yes. They were married 2 months later, in the white-clappered church in town. The reverend officiated, half the county squeezed into the pews to watch. Rachel wore a simple, elegant ivory gown that she had sewn herself. Wildflowers were braided into her dark hair. A smile graced her face that didn't falter for a single second the entire day. Matthew wore a black suit that had belonged to his father. He was nervous, his hands sweating. But the moment the church doors opened and he saw Rachel walking down the aisle, her arm looped through Mrs. Amelia's, all of his anxiety evaporated. The rest of the room faded away. There was only her. Their vows were traditional, simple. But when it came time for Rachel to speak, she went off script. She looked deep into Matthew's eyes and said, her voice ringing clear and steady through the quiet church, "I promise to love you, every single day, for the rest of my life. Thank you for waiting for me." Matthew could barely get his words out past the lump in his throat. "I will always wait for you," he whispered, tears shining in his eyes. Always. The kiss that sealed their vows was different from their first. It was a kiss of absolute devotion, of unshakable commitment, of a shared future. The reception was held back at the farm, long tables groaning with food, fiddles playing, dancing on the grass. Matthew and Rachel opened the dancing. She was still somewhat uneasy in large crowds, sensitive to loud noises and sudden movements, but wrapped safely in his arms, spinning across the lawn, she felt utterly invincible. As they swayed to the music, she whispered against his collar, "Thank you for everything." "You don't need to thank me," he murmured back. "You saved me too." "How?" "You reminded me that I'm still alive, that my heart still worked, that I was allowed to be happy again." You gave me a reason to get out of bed in the morning." Rachel rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring thud of his heartbeat. And she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. That despite the terror, despite the nightmares, despite the scars, she had found her way back to the light. 3 years later. Rachel was sitting on the porch swing, a sewing basket at her feet. But she wasn't working on a commission. She was hemming a tiny, pale yellow cotton gown. Hattie stepped out onto the porch, carrying a pitcher of cold lemonade. "That is looking precious," the older woman commented, admiring the tiny stitches. Rachel smiled brightly, her face glowing. "I still have 4 months to go. Plenty of time to make a whole wardrobe." 4 months. 4 months until she and Matthew became parents. When she first discovered she was expecting, a wave of old fear had washed over her. Fear of being an inadequate mother. Fear that her past trauma would somehow poison her child's future. Fear of the unknown. But Matthew had taken her hands in his, kissed her knuckles and said, "We'll figure it out together. And our child is going to grow up knowing they are fiercely loved every single day. That is all that matters." Now, 3 years into her marriage, Rachel was a profoundly different woman. She wasn't magically cured. Trauma like that leaves permanent marks on the soul, just as it does on the skin. But she was whole. She spoke freely and easily, only ever hesitating during moments of extreme stress. She looked vibrant and healthy, her eyes sparkling with life. She laughed loud and often. The nightmares still visited on occasion, but they were rare phantom echoes of a closed chapter. And whenever she woke up gasping in the dark, Matthew was always there, wrapping her in his arms until the trembling stopped. The farm was thriving. The wheat and corn harvests had been bountiful. With their profits, they had helped fund a small schoolhouse addition in town, where Rachel went twice a week to teach the local women how to read and write. The House of Letters, the women called it, a place where they learned not just the alphabet, but the radical idea that their voices mattered. Rachel had also finally written to her family in New York. A long, agonizingly honest letter explaining everything that had happened, why she had vanished, and the new life she had built. Her mother had written back a tear-soaked reply, begging for forgiveness for being so blind to Albert's true nature. They exchanged letters monthly now, and perhaps someday, when Rachel felt truly ready, they would arrange a visit. As for Albert Carter, he was a ghost of the past. Mrs. Edith's cousin in New York sent word that he had quietly remarried 6 months after his humiliating defeat in Ohio. He took a naive 18-year-old girl, the daughter of a desperate, impoverished merchant. Rachel prayed for that girl every night. She prayed that someone would be brave enough to save her, just as Rachel had been saved. Matthew appeared at the edge of the access road, riding his horse back from town. The moment he spotted Rachel on the porch, his face lit up, just like it did every single day. 3 years later, and he still looked at her like she was an absolute miracle. He dismounted, tied the horse to the post, and bounded up the steps. "Hello, wife," he greeted her, leaning down to press a soft kiss to the top of her head. "Hello, husband," she replied, her eyes dancing with affection. "How were things in town?" "Productive. Got top dollar for the grain at the depot, and look what I picked up at the mercantile." He pulled a paper-wrapped parcel from his saddlebag and handed it to her. Rachel unwrapped it carefully. It was a book, a beautifully bound collection of children's fairy tales. She traced the gold leaf lettering on the cover. "For the baby, for the baby, so we can read to them every night, right from the start." She flipped through the crisp pages. Vivid, colorful illustrations of brave knights, talking animals, and magical forests. "It's perfect," she whispered. Matthew sat down next to her on the swing. He placed a large, calloused hand over the gentle swell of her stomach. "How's the little one doing today?" kicking like a mule. I think they're going to be a handful. Takes after their mother, Matthew teased, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Rachel swatted his arm playfully. I am not a handful. I'm exceptionally well behaved. You never sit still for a minute, he laughed. Always doing something, teaching the women, sewing, writing your letters, tending the garden. You run me ragged just watching you. She laughed. A bright, clear sound that rang across the porch. I learned it from you. You work from dawn till dusk. Somebody has to keep a roof over this family's head. He feigned arrogant pride, puffing out his chest. They settled into a comfortable, golden silence, the porch swing creaking rhythmically, looking out over the sweeping vista, the rolling green hills, the golden fields of wheat, the endless blue sky, the long dirt road where, 3 years ago, a monster had been driven away forever. Are you happy? Matthew asked suddenly, his voice soft in the afternoon breeze. Rachel looked at him. At the man who had changed the entire trajectory of her existence. The man who had waited agonizing months just for a single smile, who had loved her when she was utterly broken, who had proved to her, day by patient day, that not all men are destroyers, that some men are healers. More than I ever thought possible, she answered truthfully. Me too, Matthew said, leaning in to rest his forehead against hers. Me too. And there, on the porch of the farmhouse where she had found sanctuary, Rachel Mary Carter was finally, irrevocably whole. Not without her scars, but whole. Not without her fears, but fiercely brave. Not without the heavy shadows of her past, but glowing with the brilliant light of her future. The sun began its slow descent behind the hills, painting the Ohio sky in vibrant strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender. The birds sang their evening lullabies. The cool breeze carried the scent of sweetgrass and damp, fertile earth. Matthew reached down and took Rachel's hand, lacing his fingers securely through hers. I love you, he told her, just as he did every single day. And Rachel, the woman who had lost her voice for so long, who had spent agonizing months trapped in an ocean of terrified silence, looked at the love of her life and replied, her voice clear, strong, and entirely her own. I love you too, always. And in that golden moment, as the sun set over the Midwestern plains, two souls that had been shattered by the world, but absolutely refused to stay that way, celebrated their greatest triumph. Not a victory over a cruel man, not even a victory over trauma, but the quiet, miraculous victory of choosing to live, of choosing to love, of choosing to believe that after the most violent storms, the sky always clears. And that sometimes, just sometimes, fairy tale endings aren't only found in the pages of children's books. They are real, they are possible, they are profoundly deserved, especially when you have the courage to wait for them, when you have kindness, and when you are lucky enough to find someone willing to wait months, years, or an entire lifetime just for you to be ready to smile.